The Mississippi heat clung to the air like a curse that summer of 1856. Natchez stood proud on its bluff, its grand mansions gleaming white against the brown river below, each one a monument to wealth built on suffering. The Duvalier estate rose above them all, 3 stories of Greek revival elegance, with columns that seemed to hold up the very sky. Gardens bloomed with magnolias and roses, their sweet scent masking something far more bitter. Locals whispered about the place, especially on auction weeks. They whispered about her, Eleanor Duvalier. In the slave quarters behind the main house, the atmosphere was suffocating. 23 souls waited in the humid darkness, knowing that tomorrow they would stand on the auction block in the forks of the road, the second largest slave market in the South. But tonight was different. They say she chooses one every time, whispered Samuel, a field hand barely 20 years old, his hands still scarred from cotton thorns. One person, every auction week. Hush your mouth, Martha snapped, though her voice trembled. She was older, had survived 3 different plantations. Talking about it makes it real, but it was already real. The door to the quarters swung open and a figure appeared. Thomas, the house servant, impeccably dressed despite the heat. His eyes were hollow, like a man who'd seen too much. "Elijah Carter," he announced flatly, "the mistress requests your presence. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories." The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Elijah stood slowly. He was tall, 25, with intelligent eyes that had learned to hide his thoughts. He'd been a carpenter on a plantation upriver before his master's debts forced this sale. He knew what tonight meant. Everyone in the quarters knew, but knowing didn't make it easier. "Walk with dignity, son," Martha whispered as he passed. "Whatever happens, don't let her take your soul." The walk to the main house felt endless. The night was alive with cicadas and distant thunder, promising a storm that never seemed to arrive. Thomas led him through the servants' entrance, up a back staircase where the walls were covered in silk damask, the color of old blood. They stopped before a door on the 2nd floor. "She'll call you in," Thomas said quietly. Then even quieter, "When you leave this room, don't speak of it, not to anyone, not ever." Before Elijah could respond, Thomas disappeared down the hallway. The door opened from within. Eleanor Duvalier stood framed by candlelight, and for a moment Elijah understood why men called her beautiful. She was perhaps 35, with pale skin that rarely saw the sun, dark hair pinned in an elaborate style, and eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. She wore a black silk dress, mourning clothes, though her husband had been dead for 3 years. "Come in, Elijah," she said softly. Her voice was cultured, tinged with French Creole. "Don't be afraid." The room was opulent, 4-poster bed draped in velvet, a fireplace burning despite the heat, tables covered with strange objects, old books, dried flowers, candles of unusual colors, and something that looked like a wooden box inlaid with silver symbols. Elijah entered, his heart hammering. The door closed behind him with a soft click. "Do you know why you're here?" Eleanor asked, moving to a small table where crystal decanters reflected the firelight. "No, Mom," Elijah replied, keeping his voice steady. "Liar." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "They talk in the quarters. They always talk." She poured 2 glasses of amber liquid, bourbon by the smell. "But what they say, and what is true, these are different things." She handed him a glass. He didn't take it. Eleanor's smile faded. "You think I mean to harm you?" "I think," Elijah chose his words carefully, "that nothing good happens when powerful people summon those who have no power." Something flickered across her face. Surprise, respect. "You're educated, that's rare. Dangerous, but rare." She set both glasses down. "Sit, Elijah. We need to talk, and standing there like a condemned man won't make this easier." He didn't sit. What do you want from me? Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at the dark grounds below. Do you believe in ghosts, Elijah? In debts that transcend death? In sins so heavy they anchor you to this world like chains? I believe in the chains I can see, ma'am. She turned to face him, and in the candlelight he saw something in her eyes that chilled him more than anger ever could. Desperation. My husband, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, Charles Duvalier, was a monster. Not the kind that shows fangs, but the kind that smiles at dinner parties while planning atrocities in the cellar. She moved closer. He died 3 years ago, supposedly of heart failure. But hearts don't fail on their own, Elijah. Sometimes they need encouragement. Elijah's mind raced. Was she confessing to murder? Before he died, Eleanor continued, he did something unspeakable, something I discovered only after they lowered him into the ground. And now, she gestured to the strange objects around the room, now I'm trying to undo it. She opened the wooden box. Inside was a leather journal, its pages yellow with age. 23 people will be sold tomorrow, Eleanor said. 23 souls. But one of them carries something, a mark, a curse, a piece of unfinished business that my husband left behind. I don't know which one. That's why I bring people here. Not for what they whisper about, but to see. She pulled out the journal, and Elijah saw pages filled with names, dates, and strange symbols. I'm looking for someone, Eleanor whispered. Someone connected to a crime my husband committed 15 years ago. Someone whose family he destroyed. Someone who carries the key to breaking this curse. Thunder rumbled closer now, and the candles flickered. What curse? Elijah demanded. Eleanor looked at him with eyes full of shadows. The one that keeps him from staying dead. As if in answer, a door somewhere in the house slammed shut. No wind, no servant, just a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. He walks these halls at night, Eleanor said quietly, looking for what he lost, looking for revenge. And until I find the right person, until I undo what he did, he'll never stop. She stepped closer to Elijah, searching his face in the candlelight. So tell me, Elijah Carter, what are you running from? What tragedy brought you to this auction block? Because everyone in those quarters is here for a reason, and some reasons go deeper than debt. Elijah's throat tightened. She couldn't possibly know, could she? I don't know what you're talking about, he said. Eleanor smiled sadly. Then we'll have to find out together, because whoever carries the connection to my husband's greatest sin, that person holds the key to both our freedoms. She opened the journal to a page, marked with a black ribbon. There were 3 names written there, 2 crossed out. The third name made Elijah's blood run cold. Carter. Your family name, Eleanor whispered. It appears in my husband's records from 1841, a plantation in Louisiana, a fire, and a little girl who disappeared that night. Her eyes locked onto his. Do you remember her, Elijah? Do you remember what happened 15 years ago? The candles guttered. Somewhere in the house, footsteps echoed where no one should be walking, and Elijah realized that tomorrow's auction wasn't his only problem. Some prices couldn't be paid in money, some chains were invisible, and some nights demanded truth as their toll. Tell me, Eleanor whispered as thunder finally broke, and rain began to hammer the windows. Tell me what you remember about the night the Belmont plantation burned. Tell me about the girl. Tell me about the man who started the fire. Elijah's hands clenched into fists. Why should I tell you anything? Because if you don't, Eleanor said quietly, moving to the window where lightning now illuminated the grounds, we'll both be trapped here forever. You on the auction block, sold and resold until you break. And me. She touched the glass, her reflection ghostly. Me in this house with a dead man who refuses to stay buried. Another door slammed, closer this time. He's listening, Eleanor breathed. He always listens. And if we don't break this curse by dawn, he'll know you're the one. And what he did to your family 15 years ago will seem merciful compared to what he'll do to you. The storm raged outside. Inside, the temperature dropped despite the fire. And in the hallway beyond the door, something began to scratch at the wood, slow, deliberate, patient. Elijah looked at the door, then at Eleanor, then at the journal with his family name written in dead man's ink. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Eleanor's eyes filled with something between hope and horror. "Remember," she said simply. "Remember everything, because the only way to break a curse is to speak the truth it's been built to hide." The scratching at the door grew louder. And the long night had only just begun. The scratching stopped. Eleanor moved swiftly to the door, pressing her hand against it. She whispered something. Words Elijah couldn't quite hear, though they sounded like French mixed with something older, something that made the air feel heavy. The presence beyond the door withdrew, but Elijah could sense it hadn't gone far. It was waiting, listening. "Sit," Eleanor commanded, her composure returning. "We don't have much time. Once the storm passes, the protection weakens." "Protection?" Elijah finally took the seat she'd offered earlier, his mind reeling. Eleanor poured the bourbon again, this time drinking from one glass herself. Salt lines at every threshold, iron nails under every window, prayers written on paper and hidden in the walls. She laughed bitterly. "I've turned this mansion into a prison. For him and for me." She sat across from Elijah, the journal between them. Belmont Plantation, Louisiana. November 1841. "Tell me what you remember." Elijah's jaw tightened. "I was 10 years old. I shouldn't remember anything, but you do." He did. God help him, he did. "My mother worked in the house," he began slowly. "My father was the blacksmith. We lived in better quarters than most, not good, but better. My mother, she could read. She'd been taught by her previous mistress before being sold. She taught me in secret." Eleanor leaned forward, listening intently. "There was a girl," Elijah continued, his voice distant. "Céline, she was the master's daughter by his wife, a real daughter, white, about 8 years old. She got sick that autumn, fever that wouldn't break. The doctors came from New Orleans, but nothing helped. And your mother? She knew herbs, remedies passed down from her grandmother. The mistress was desperate, so she asked my mother to try." Elijah's hands trembled slightly. It worked. The fever broke. Céline survived. "That should have been a blessing," Eleanor said quietly. "Should have been." Elijah's voice hardened. "But the master, Edmond Belmont, he couldn't stand it. Couldn't stand that a slave had saved his daughter when white doctors failed. Couldn't stand that his wife praised my mother. Couldn't stand that little Céline called my mother Aunt Sarah and wanted her nearby." Thunder rumbled, softer now, moving away. "He became obsessed," Elijah continued. "Paranoid. He started saying my mother had used dark magic, that she'd cursed Céline first, then removed the curse to gain favor. He told his wife, told the neighbors, told anyone who'd listen. And no one believed a slave's denial," Eleanor finished. "No one," Elijah's voice cracked. "He decided to make an example, to prove that magic couldn't save her. He gathered everyone, every enslaved person on that plantation, and made us watch." The room had grown colder. Even the fire seemed to dim. "They tied my mother to a post in the yard. He said if she was innocent, God would spare her. If she was a witch, she'd burn." Elijah closed his eyes. "He set the fire himself, but something went wrong. The wind changed. Sparks caught the main house. Within minutes, everything was burning. And Céline," Eleanor's voice was barely audible, "she was inside. They couldn't reach her. The house collapsed." Elijah opened his eyes, and they were dry. He'd spent all his tears years ago. "My mother died. The master's daughter died, and Edmond Belmont went mad with grief and guilt. He died 6 months later, they said. But before he did, he started writing about revenge, about debts unpaid, about making sure that anyone connected to that night would never find peace." Eleanor's hand trembled as she opened the journal to another page. There, in meticulous handwriting, was a list of names. Sarah Carter was at the top. Below it, her son, her husband. Her bloodline unto the 7th generation. He didn't just kill your mother, Eleanor whispered. He cursed your entire family. I don't believe in curses, Elijah said, but his voice lacked conviction. Then why has every Carter died young since that night? Eleanor turned more pages. Your father, killed in an accident 3 years after the fire. Your uncle, drowned. Your cousin, fever took him in a week. Your aunt. She looked up. You're the last one, Elijah, the last Carter. And tomorrow you were supposed to be sold to a plantation in Georgia where the mortality rate is— I know, he interrupted quietly. But what you don't know, Eleanor continued, is who bought you, who specifically requested you be held here in Natchez for this auction. Elijah's stomach dropped. Who? Eleanor turned the journal around. There, in recent ink, was a purchase order signed 2 weeks ago. Charles Duvalier, request Elijah Carter, age 25, formerly of Louisiana. Carpentry skills, last of the Carter line. That's impossible, Elijah breathed. You said your husband died 3 years ago. I did. He did. Eleanor's eyes were haunted. But before he died, he made arrangements. My husband was connected to Edmund Bellamont. They were business partners, friends. Charles was there that night, Elijah. He witnessed the fire. He witnessed everything. The scratching at the door returned, more insistent now. And when Edmund died, Eleanor continued rapidly, he left something to Charles, a box, instructions, and a piece of paper with one sentence. Finish what I started. What does that mean? It means, Eleanor said, standing and beginning to pace, that Charles took up Edmund's obsession. He spent years tracking the Carter family, making sure the curse continued, making sure every tragedy looked like an accident. And when he knew he was dying, he made one final arrangement to ensure you, the last Carter, would come here to this house on this night. Why? Elijah stood as well, anger rising. What's the point? What does killing my family accomplish? Not killing, Eleanor said desperately. Binding. Don't you see? Edmund Bellamont couldn't accept that your mother saved his daughter. Couldn't accept that a slave had power he didn't. So he created a binding curse. Every Carter death feeds it, makes it stronger. And when the last Carter dies— She opened the box again, revealing more than just the journal. There were objects inside, a lock of dark hair, a child's wooden doll, a piece of burnt cloth, and a small portrait of a young girl with sad eyes, Céline Bellamont. He's trying to bring her back, Eleanor whispered. That's what this has always been about. Edmund Bellamont's guilt was so profound, his grief so consuming, that he sought out dark practices. He believed if he could anchor enough souls to his pain, enough blood sacrifice, he could trade them for hers, bring his daughter back from death. That's insane. Yes. Eleanor's laugh was brittle, but it's also working, because Charles continued it. And now Charles is dead, but he's not gone. He's trapped between, maintaining the curse, waiting for you. The final piece. The scratching became pounding. The door shook in its frame. If you die tonight, Eleanor said urgently, the curse completes. 7 generations of Carters, all fed to an impossible bargain. And what comes back won't be Céline Bellamont. It'll be something else, something wearing her face. Then how do I stop it? Lightning flashed, and in that brief illumination, Elijah saw something through the window, a figure standing in the garden below. A man in old-fashioned clothes, watching the house with hollow eyes. Charles Duvalier. We break the curse at its source, Eleanor said, grabbing a candle. We speak the truth that's been buried. We give the real Céline peace, and we end this. How? Eleanor moved to the fireplace, pulling at a brick until it came loose. Behind it was a hidden compartment containing a single letter sealed with wax. "This is Celine's last words," Eleanor said. "Written by her before the fire, hidden by a housemaid who loved her. Charles found it years ago, but he never opened it. Never let anyone read it, because if the truth comes out, the door burst open, but nothing came through. Not yet." The threshold held. "Because if the truth comes out," Eleanor finished in a rush, "the entire curse falls apart. And Charles, trapped in death, knows it. That's why he's fighting so hard. That's why this night matters." Elijah stared at the letter. "What truth?" "I don't know. Charles never let me read it, but Celine wrote it the day before she died. She was 8 years old and she knew something that would have saved your mother." The temperature plummeted. Both their breaths came out as mist. From the hallway came a voice, rough, angry, inhuman, yet terribly human. "She's mine. They're all mine. You cannot break what's paid for in blood." Eleanor grabbed Elijah's arm. "We have to go to the cellar. There's a room there where Charles performed the rituals to maintain Edmund's curse. It's the anchor point. If we burn this letter there, read it aloud, expose the truth, we break the binding," Elijah finished, "or we die trying." The figure from the garden was now at the window, pressing against the glass. Lightning revealed Charles Duvalier's face, handsome once, now twisted with obsession and decay. "The boy dies tonight," the thing said. "The last Carter falls. The debt is paid." Eleanor pulled Elijah toward a servant's passage hidden behind a bookshelf. "Run." They ran through narrow corridors, down winding stairs, while behind them the house began to wake. Doors slammed, portraits fell from walls, and that terrible voice echoed through every room. "You cannot escape the price of salvation. Every miracle demands a sacrifice. Every life saved requires a death. This is the law." They reached the cellar door, thick wood banded with iron. Eleanor fumbled with keys, while Elijah looked back up the stairs. Shadows moved against shadows, taking forms that hurt to look at directly. The key turned. The door opened. They descended into darkness, Eleanor's candle, their only light. The cellar was vast, far larger than the house above should allow. Symbols covered every wall, drawn in chalk, carved in stone, written in substances Elijah chose not to identify. At the center was a circle. Inside it more objects, bones arranged in patterns, candles of black wax, and a book bound in leather that looked like skin. "This is where he did it," Eleanor breathed, "where Charles called to Edmund across death, where they maintained the curse together." She stepped into the circle carefully, motioning for Elijah to follow. "Once we're inside, we're protected. But we have to read the letter. We have to speak Celine's truth. And whatever it says, however it hurts, we cannot stop." "Do you understand?" Elijah nodded. They stood together in the circle. Eleanor broke the wax seal on the letter with trembling hands. The paper inside was written in a child's careful script. Thunder shook the house above. The voice, no longer Charles alone, but mixed with something older, darker, screamed down through the floors. "Do not read it. Do not speak her words. She belongs to the silence. She belongs to the debt." Eleanor began to read aloud. And the truth that had been buried for 15 years finally began to surface. Eleanor's voice shook as she read Céline Bellemont's letter, written in careful, looping script that betrayed the 8-year-old's education. "My name is Céline Marie Belmont, and I write this because Aunt Sarah says the truth must be spoken, even when it is hard, especially when it is hard." The cellar groaned around them. Dust fell from the rafters. Something heavy dragged across the floor above, slow, deliberate hunting. "I was sick. Mama says I almost died. The doctors came with their knives and leeches and bitter medicine, but I only got worse. I heard them tell Papa I wouldn't see Christmas." Eleanor's hands trembled so badly that Elijah had to steady them, his fingers overlapping hers on the ancient paper. Together, they held Celine's final testimony. Then Aunt Sarah came. "She's not my real aunt. She's a slave, and Mama says I shouldn't call her that where Papa can hear. But she's kind, and her hands smell like the herbs in her garden, and when she touches my forehead I feel safe." "No." The voice from above was anguished now, no longer just angry. "Don't make me hear it again. Don't make me remember." Aunt Sarah gave me tea that tasted like earth and honey. She sang songs in a language I didn't understand. She told me stories about her own daughter who died, and how love is stronger than sickness. I got better. The fever left like a bad dream fading. The circle of protection flickered. The candles inside guttered but held. I should have been happy. Mama was happy. She cried and thanked Aunt Sarah and gave her a silver comb from her own hair. "But Papa—" Eleanor's voice caught. She had to stop, breathe, continue. "Papa was angry. I don't understand why. He said terrible things. He said Aunt Sarah was a witch. He said she'd cursed me first and only removed the curse to gain favor. But that's not true. I know it's not true because—" "Stop!" The dragging sound had reached the cellar door. Something scratched at the wood with what sounded like fingernails filed to bone. The child didn't understand. She was confused, delirious. She didn't know what she was saying. Elijah's voice joined Eleanor's, both of them reading now, refusing to let the darkness silence the light. "I know it's not true, because I wasn't sick from any natural fever. I was sick because of what I saw." The scratching stopped. Complete silence fell over the house, more terrible than any sound. 3 weeks before I got sick, I couldn't sleep. I heard voices in Papa's study, so I crept down the stairs. The door was open a crack. I saw Papa and another man, tall, with dark hair and a scar on his cheek. They were looking at papers and talking about money. Eleanor's breath caught. "Charles," she whispered. She saw Charles. The dark-haired man said, "The property in Natchez would be perfect for expansion, but we need more capital." And Papa said, "Then we'll get it. There are ways to liquidate assets without raising suspicion." Elijah frowned. Liquidate assets. I didn't understand then, but I do now. They were talking about selling people, not just from our plantation, but from others. They had a plan. To buy plantations that were failing, separate families quickly, sell people to different states before anyone could organize escapes or revolts. They called it efficient market redistribution. "Dear God," Eleanor breathed. They were running a trafficking network. But that's not the worst part. The temperature dropped so sharply that ice began forming on the cellar walls. The dark-haired man said, "What about the woman, Sarah? She knows too much. She's been watching, learning. Slaves who read are dangerous." And Papa said, "I'll handle her." Eleanor's voice rose, defiant against the howling that now came from every corner of the house. They knew Aunt Sarah could read. They knew she'd seen their papers when she cleaned the study. They were afraid she'd tell someone or write it down or teach other slaves to read their own sale documents and learn what was being done to them. "That's why Papa called me sick," the letter continued. "That's why he brought in all those doctors, to make a show, to create witnesses, because he was planning something terrible, and he needed everyone to believe that when it happened, it was justified." The cellar door exploded inward, but the circle held. What stood in the doorway was no longer fully Charles Duvalier. It was something merged, Charles and Edmond Bellamont, their obsessions and guilt twisted together into a single, writhing form. Behind it, shadows of other faces appeared, victims of the trafficking network, souls bound by the curse, all the unnamed dead who'd been efficiently redistributed and lost to history. "She was a child," the thing said, and now its voice was clearly Edmund's. "She didn't understand business. She didn't understand necessity. She didn't understand that some people are property, and property doesn't get to have secrets or power or—" "Let her finish," Elijah said coldly. "Let your daughter finish." The thing recoiled as if struck. Eleanor read on, tears streaming down her face. Papa decided to accuse Aunt Sarah of witchcraft. He knew the other plantation owners would help him. They were all afraid of smart slaves, of slaves who could read and plan and resist. He thought if he made her a warning, if he made it public and brutal, no one would dare question him about anything else. But I heard it all, and the knowledge made me sick. Not fever, guilt, horror, grief for what I knew was coming and couldn't stop, because I'm 8 years old, and no one listens to children, especially not when they speak against their fathers. I tried, the letter continued, Celine's handwriting becoming more erratic. I told Mama, but she said I was delirious. I told the housekeeper, but she said I was having nightmares. I even tried to tell Aunt Sarah herself, but she just held me and said, "Hush, child, don't worry yourself about grown folks' troubles." She didn't believe a man would murder her just to keep her quiet. She thought her value as a healer would protect her. The thing in the doorway began to fracture, its form splitting between the two men it contained. So I'm writing this down, hiding it. If something happens to Aunt Sarah, if Papa does what I heard him planning, then someone needs to know the truth. She was not a witch. She was not dangerous. She was inconvenient. She knew too much about bad men doing bad things, and they killed her for it. And if something happens to me, if the guilt kills me, or the fear, or if Papa decides children can be inconvenient too, then let it be known. I loved Aunt Sarah more than I feared my father. And if there is any justice in heaven or on earth, let the truth set us all free. The letter was signed with the child's careful signature, Céline Marie Belmont, November 14th, 1841. One day before the fire, Eleanor lowered the paper. She knew, she whispered. She knew what her father was, and it destroyed her. She didn't understand, Edmund's voice cracked. I was protecting our interests, protecting our way of life. I had to. I had no choice. You always had a choice, Elijah said quietly. You chose money over mercy, secrets over souls, and you taught your daughter that love was less important than power. I loved my daughter. You loved your comfort more, Eleanor snapped. Just like Charles loved his. That's why you found each other. That's why he continued your curse. Because you were the same, men so terrified of losing control that you'd burn the world to keep it. The thing began to scream, not words anymore, just rage and denial, and the sound of two men realizing they'd damned themselves for nothing. But Céline, Eleanor continued, holding up the letter like a weapon, she chose differently. At 8 years old, facing death and horror, she chose truth. She chose love. And that breaks your curse more thoroughly than any ritual. She threw the letter into the center of the circle. It burst into flames, but not ordinary flames. These burned white-hot and clean, consuming the paper without smoke, releasing light that spread throughout the cellar like water. The symbols on the walls began to crack. The binding circle shattered, the dark candles gutted out. And the thing in the doorway, both men, all their victims, the entire architecture of lies they'd built, began to dissolve. No, Edmund whispered as he faded. No, I did everything for her. I sold my soul for her. You sold your soul for yourself, Elijah said. You just used her name as an excuse. Charles, Edmund's voice called out to his partner as the light consumed them both. Charles, help me. We can still... But Charles Duvalier was already gone, his form scattered like ash, and with him went the purchase order, the binding ritual, the curse that had haunted the Carter family for 15 years. Eleanor staggered, suddenly released from whatever had been holding her to this house. It's over, she gasped. I can feel it. The binding on this house, it's broken. The cellar began to collapse, not violently but gently, like something exhaling after holding its breath too long. The dark artifacts crumbled to dust. The blood-stained symbols faded from the walls. We have to go, Elijah said, taking Eleanor's arm and pulling her toward the stairs. They climbed through a house that was transforming around them. Portraits of Charles straightened on their own. Doors opened to let fresh air in. The oppressive weight that had filled every room lifted like morning fog. They emerged into the entrance hall just as dawn broke through the windows. Real dawn, clean and clear, not the sickly grey that had plagued this place for 3 years. Thomas stood at the door, his eyes wide with shock. "Mistress, I felt something change." "It did, Thomas," Eleanor said softly. "It's finally over." She turned to Elijah. "You're free to go. The auction, I can cancel it. I have the authority." "And your paperwork?" She smiled. "I think there might be an unfortunate fire in the records office. A complete accident, of course." Elijah stared at her. "You'd do that?" "Celine did more at 8 years old than I did at 35, Eleanor said quietly. "It's time I learned from her. Time I chose truth over comfort." But before Elijah could respond, Thomas cleared his throat. "Mistress, there's a problem. The auction. It's already been finalized. Last night. Before all this." "A buyer has already claimed Mr. Carter." Eleanor's face went pale. "That's impossible. Charles's order was—" "Not Charles, ma'am." Thomas looked ill. "Someone else. The paperwork came through an hour ago. Elijah Carter has been sold to—" He swallowed hard. "To Blackwood Plantation in Georgia." The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Blackwood Plantation was infamous throughout the South, a hell on earth where slaves were worked to death within a year. No one who went to Blackwood ever came back. "No," Eleanor breathed. "No, we broke the curse. This shouldn't—" "The curse on your house is broken," Elijah said quietly. "But the curse of slavery, that's still very much alive." He was right. They'd defeated 2 evil men and their supernatural conspiracy. But the system those men had thrived in, the vast machinery of human bondage, remained untouched. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. "Then we fight that too." "How?" Elijah asked bitterly. You can't just free me. There are laws, procedures, witnesses, and even if you could, there are 22 other people in those quarters who'll be sold today. What about them?" Eleanor's mind raced. "Then we need help, real help." She turned to Thomas. "Who in Natchez can be trusted? Who has the resources to fight this?" Thomas hesitated. There's a network. We don't speak of it openly. But there are people, black and white, who help. The Underground Railroad has routes through Mississippi, though they're dangerous. And there's a lawyer, a Quaker named Josiah Wright, who sometimes takes cases for— "Get him," Eleanor interrupted. "Now. Tell him I'll pay whatever he asks. And Thomas—" She looked at her servant with new eyes. "I'm sorry for everything this house has been, for everything I allowed to continue. That ends today." Thomas's eyes glistened. "Yes, ma'am." As he left, Eleanor turned back to Elijah. "I know this doesn't fix anything. I know one woman trying to do right doesn't balance out centuries of wrong, but it's a start." Elijah finished. Outside, the sun rose over Natchez, illuminating a city built on suffering, a city where fortunes were made and souls were sold, where beauty masked brutality and everyone pretended not to hear the screams from the auction blocks. But in one house, at least, the truth had finally been spoken. And sometimes that's all a revolution needs to begin. 3 hours later, Josiah Wright sat in Eleanor Duvalier's parlor, his Quaker simplicity stark against the room's opulence. He was perhaps 50, with steel-grey hair and eyes that had seen too much injustice to be shocked by any new revelation. "What thee describes," he said carefully, reviewing the documents Eleanor had provided, "is not merely individual wickedness. It is an organized operation that spans multiple states." Eleanor paced by the window. Outside, she could see the slave quarters where 23 people waited in the heat, unaware that their fate was being debated in the main house. "Can you stop the auction?" "Not legally, no. The sales are contracted, but—" Wright adjusted his spectacles. "If thee could prove that the acquisition of these people was itself illegal, fraud, forged documents, criminal conspiracy, then yes, the contracts would be void." Elijah, who'd been standing silently by the door, spoke up. Charles Duvalier kept meticulous records. Everything's in his study, ledgers, correspondence, maps of the network. If we can prove what he and Belmont built, then we expose everyone involved, Wright finished. And in doing so, create enough legal chaos that no sale can proceed until the matter is investigated. He paused. Of course, this would require the cooperation of the current property holder, Mrs. Duvalier, in testifying against her late husband's business partners. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. I'll do it. Thee understands what this means? The social consequences? Thee will be ostracized. Thy family name, my family name, is already cursed, Eleanor said quietly. Better to curse it honestly than to preserve it through silence. Wright nodded slowly. Then we have work to do, and very little time. The auction begins at noon. They moved to Charles's study, a room Eleanor had avoided for 3 years. Thomas helped them, along with 2 other house servants who, sensing the shift in their mistress, began to hope. What they found was damning. Charles Duvalier had documented everything. Perhaps it was arrogance, or perhaps he genuinely believed no one would ever dare challenge him, but his records were complete. Names of co-conspirators, routes used to transport enslaved people across state lines, forged bills of sale, plantation owners who'd been convinced to sell at reduced prices, and most damning, a list of officials who'd been bribed to look the other way. Dear God, Wright breathed as he read. The sheriff is on here, 3 judges, the mayor of Natchez, even... He stopped, his face going pale. What? Eleanor asked. The auctioneer conducting today's sale. Marcus Pemberton. He's listed as primary distribution coordinator. Wright looked up. He's not just running the auction. He's running the entire network now that Duvalier is dead. The room fell silent. Then we can't just stop one sale, Elijah said. We have to bring down the whole operation. That's impossible, Thomas said quietly from the doorway. Pemberton has connections everywhere. Even if you expose him, He'll what? Eleanor turned to face her servants. Continue destroying lives. Continue what my husband started. No. We end this today. Wright stood, gathering the documents. I need to get these to Judge Harrison. He's not on the bribe list, which means he might still have integrity. If I can convince him to issue an emergency injunction, you'll never make it, Thomas interrupted. Pemberton has men watching the roads. He's been paranoid since Mr. Duvalier died, worried someone would find the records. If he sees you leaving here with documents... Then we create a distraction, Elijah said. Something that draws Pemberton's attention away from the lawyer and toward something else. Like what? Eleanor asked, Elijah's jaw set with determination. Like me. I'm supposed to be sold today. If I disappear, if Pemberton thinks I've escaped, he'll focus all his resources on finding me. That gives Mr. Right time to reach the judge. That's suicide, Eleanor said flatly. If they catch you, if I don't try, I'm dead anyway. Blackwood Plantation might take a year to kill me, but it'll kill me just the same. Elijah looked at the documents spread across the desk. At least this way, my death might mean something. No one is dying, Wright said firmly. Thee is right about the distraction, but we need to be smarter about this. Thomas, how many people in the quarters can be trusted? Thomas considered. All of them if they know what's really happening. But they're scared, hopeless. Then we give them hope, Eleanor said suddenly. And we give them a choice. She turned to Thomas. Gather them, all of them. Bring them to the house. Ma'am. Now, Thomas, we don't have much time. 20 minutes later, 23 enslaved people stood in Eleanor Duvalier's entrance hall, something that would have been unthinkable the day before. They looked terrified, confused, certain this was some new cruelty. Eleanor stood on the stairs where she could see them all. Her voice shook, but she forced herself to speak clearly. My name is Eleanor Duvalier, and I owe you all an apology. My husband was an evil man. I knew he was cruel, but I didn't let myself know how deep that evil ran. Last night I learned the truth, and now I need your help to stop it from continuing." She nodded to Elijah, who stepped forward with some of the documents. "Many of you were brought here through fraud," Elijah explained. "Illegal sales, forged papers, families separated through criminal conspiracy. The man running today's auction, Marcus Pemberton, he's the one maintaining the operation. If we can expose him, if we can get these documents to an honest judge, the sales are void, all of them." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Disbelief, fear, a desperate flicker of hope. "But we need time," Eleanor continued. "And we need some of you to be brave in a way you've already been brave your entire lives. We need volunteers to create a distraction, to give the appearance of an escape attempt, while Mr. Wright gets these documents to Judge Harrison." "Why should we trust you?" A woman's voice, sharp with decades of betrayal. Martha, the older woman who'd warned Elijah the night before. "You're the mistress. This could be a trap." "It could be," Eleanor acknowledged. "I have no right to ask for your trust, but I'm asking anyway. Because the alternative is watching all of you be sold to plantations like Blackwood, watching this evil continue, watching more families destroyed." "What happens if we say no?" another voice asked. "Then the auction proceeds. You're sold, and Eleanor's voice broke. "I go back to being complicit, to being part of the machinery that grinds you into dust, and I don't think I can do that anymore." Silence stretched. Then Samuel, the young field hand, stepped forward. "I'll do it. I'll be part of the distraction." "Samuel, no," Martha started. "I'm going to Blackwood anyway," Samuel said quietly. "Already on the list. At least this way. Maybe I save somebody else from going." 3 others stepped forward, then 2 more. Within minutes, 8 people had volunteered, more than enough. Wright pulled Eleanor aside. "Thee understands that even if this works, even if we void today's sales, these people are still considered property under law. We can't free them all." "Not today," Eleanor agreed, "but we can start the legal process, file manumission papers, and in the meantime," she looked at her house, her prison, her inheritance, her curse. "They can stay here. As paid workers, not slaves. It's not freedom, not yet, but it's not chains either." Wright nodded slowly. "Thee is either very brave or very foolish. Probably both." The plan was simple in concept, dangerous in execution. Samuel and the other volunteers would stage a visible escape attempt, running toward the river, making enough noise to alert Pemberton's patrols. Meanwhile, Wright would take a back road to Judge Harrison's residence, accompanied by Thomas and 2 other trusted servants who knew the paths through the woods. Elijah insisted on being part of the distraction group. "I'm the one they want most," he argued. "My presence makes it believable." Eleanor wanted to protest, but knew he was right. At 11 o'clock, as the sun climbed toward noon and the auction approached, the volunteers slipped out through the garden. They moved toward the river road visible from town, their flight deliberately obvious. Within minutes, shouts rang out. Pemberton's men had spotted them. In the chaos that followed, dogs barking, horses galloping, men shouting, Wright and his group slipped away in the opposite direction, documents hidden in oilskin beneath their clothes. Elijah ran with the others, his heart pounding. They weren't actually trying to escape. That would be impossible. But they needed to maintain the illusion long enough for Wright to reach the judge. "Split up!" Samuel called as they reached the cotton fields. "Make them work for it!" The group scattered. Elijah veered left, crashing through cotton plants, hearing pursuit close behind. He could see the river now, muddy and wide, offering no salvation but at least an endpoint. A shot rang out. Elijah dove into the cotton, crawling through the rows, thorns tearing at his clothes. Behind him, men crashed through the plants, cursing. "There! I see one!" More shots. These weren't trying to kill. Runaway slaves were worthless dead, but they were close enough to terrify. Elijah burst out onto the riverbank and nearly collided with Marcus Pemberton himself. The auctioneer was a large man, red-faced with rage and exertion. "Well, well, the Carter boy. Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused?" "Not nearly enough," Elijah gasped. Pemberton's fist caught him across the jaw, dropping him to his knees. "You think you're clever? You think this little stunt changes anything?" He grabbed Elijah by the collar, hauling him up. "You're still mine, still property, and after today, I'm personally delivering you to Blackwood. I want to watch them break you." "You might want to delay that trip," a new voice said. Pemberton spun. Judge Harrison stood at the top of the riverbank, flanked by Wright and 6 federal marshals. The judge held Charles Duvalier's documents in his hand. "Marcus Pemberton," Harrison said formally, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, human trafficking, and bribery of public officials. These gentlemen will be taking you into custody." Pemberton's face went from red to white. "You can't. Those documents are lies." "These documents are in your co-conspirator's handwriting," Harrison countered, "including letters in which you discuss specific illegal transactions by name and date. I've already dispatched marshals to arrest the other individuals named. It's over, Mr. Pemberton." The auctioneer looked around wildly, but his own men were backing away, suddenly unwilling to be associated with him. He lunged toward the river, perhaps thinking to swim for it, but the marshals were faster. Within moments, Pemberton was in chains. Judge Harrison approached Elijah, who was still on his knees, bleeding from his mouth. "You must be Mr. Carter. Mr. Wright has told me your story. Remarkable, truly." He offered his hand. "Can you stand?" Elijah took the offered hand, pulling himself up. "The others, the ones who ran with me, are being rounded up, but not harmed," Harrison assured him. "I've issued a temporary injunction, halting all sales pending investigation of these documents. No one is being auctioned today." The weight of those words took a moment to fully land. "No one," Elijah repeated. "No one. Furthermore, given the evidence of fraud in the acquisition of the individuals currently held at the Duvalier estate, I'm placing them under court protection until their legal status can be properly determined." Harrison's expression softened. "It's not freedom, Mr. Carter. The law is still the law, and I cannot simply declare people free without proper process, but it's time to sort truth from lies, legitimate claims from criminal enterprises." Eleanor arrived, breathless from running. "Judge Harrison, thank you for—" "Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Duvalier," Harrison interrupted. "Your cooperation is appreciated, but you'll be called to testify. Your husband's business partners will fight this viciously. You've made powerful enemies today." "I know," Eleanor said quietly, "but I've also found my conscience. That seems a fair trade." By sunset, Natchez was in turmoil. The arrest of Marcus Pemberton and the seizure of the Duvalier documents had sent shockwaves through the entire region. 4 other planters were arrested by evening. 2 judges fled. The mayor locked himself in his office and refused to speak to anyone. The 23 people who should have been sold that day remained at the Duvalier estate, now under the protection of federal law rather than Eleanor's ownership. It was a strange limbo. Not free, not enslaved, but something in between. Eleanor met with each of them individually, offering what she could: wages for work, the option to stay or leave once their legal status was resolved, and most importantly, an apology that words could barely contain. That night, Elijah stood on the balcony where Eleanor had first summoned him. It felt like years ago rather than a single night. Eleanor joined him, both of them looking out at the estate bathed in moonlight. "What will you do?" she asked quietly, "when the legal matters are resolved?" "I don't know," Elijah admitted. "For 15 years, I've been running from a curse. Now that it's broken, I don't know who I am without it." "You're whoever you choose to be," Eleanor said. "That's terrifying, I know. I'm facing the same question. Without my husband's money, without his name, without the society that my family built," she laughed softly, "I'm discovering I'm no one at all." "That's not true," Elijah said. "Today you were someone who chose right over easy. That's more than most people ever manage." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. "Wright thinks the legal battles will take months," Eleanor said eventually. "Maybe years. But he's confident that given the evidence of fraud, most of you will eventually be freed through the courts. Not all at once, and not without fighting, but it's possible," Elijah finished. "A day ago, it wasn't even possible. Now it is. That's something." "It's everything," Eleanor corrected quietly. In the quarters below, people were gathered around a small fire, talking quietly. For the first time in memory, they weren't whispering in fear, but speaking in hope. Fragile, careful hope, but hope nonetheless. Samuel's voice rose in song, an old spiritual. But the words seemed different now. Not just about a distant heaven, but about a freedom that might be touched, tasted, lived. Others joined him, their voices weaving together in the darkness. Eleanor found herself humming along, and then, hesitantly, singing. Her French Creole accent strange against the African rhythms, but trying, learning. Elijah watched her and thought about Céline Bellamont, 8 years old, choosing love over fear, choosing truth over comfort, starting a revolution with nothing but a letter and a brave heart. Maybe that's all any revolution needed. One person choosing differently, then another, until the chorus became unstoppable. 3 months later, autumn came to Natchez with unusual force. The heat broke suddenly, replaced by cold winds that stripped the magnolias bare and turned the river grey. The legal battles Wright had predicted were even more brutal than expected. Eleanor sat in courtroom after courtroom, testifying about her husband's business dealings. The details were excruciating, not just the trafficking network, but the scope of Charles's corruption. He'd been involved in fraudulent land sales, bribery, even connections to illegal imports through the port of New Orleans. Each revelation destroyed another piece of Eleanor's social standing. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. The ladies' auxiliary expelled her. Anonymous letters arrived daily, some threatening, most simply hateful. "You've become a pariah," Wright observed after a particularly difficult day in court. They sat in Eleanor's study, smaller now, with most of the valuable furniture sold to pay legal fees and the wages she'd promised to the people living on her estate. "Good," Eleanor said tiredly. "I was a parasite before. At least now I'm an honest outcast." The work of running the estate, with paid labor rather than enslaved people, was harder than Eleanor had imagined. She'd thought simply offering wages would be enough, but she'd underestimated how much the entire system depended on coercion. Martha, who'd agreed to manage the household, educated her bluntly. "You can't just say, 'I'll pay you,' and expect everything to work the same way. We need contracts, written terms, the right to refuse work without punishment, the right to leave if we find better opportunities." "Yes, of course," Eleanor had agreed quickly. "And you need to understand," Martha continued, her voice gentler but firm, "that we don't trust you, can't trust you, not yet, maybe not ever. You have to prove yourself every single day." It was humbling work. Eleanor found herself learning from people she'd once considered property, learning about fair negotiation, about respect, about the difference between compliance and cooperation. Elijah had stayed, though Eleanor suspected it was more because he had nowhere else to go than out of any loyalty to her. He'd taken charge of repairs on the estate, work that had been neglected during Charles's final years, and proved himself an exceptional carpenter. He also proved himself skilled at something else: documentation. "We need to record everything," he told Wright during one of the lawyer's visits. "Every person who passes through here, every family separated by the trafficking network, names, dates, last known locations. If we're going to reunite families, we need information." It became his project, creating a registry of the network's victims. At night, By candlelight, he interviewed the people staying at the estate, writing down their stories, their lost connections, their desperate hopes of finding mothers, fathers, children sold away years ago. The registry grew, 20 names, 50, 100. Wright began using it in court, demonstrating the scope of the conspiracy. Each name was evidence, each story a nail in the coffin of Pemberton's defense. The auctioneer, facing overwhelming evidence, finally broke. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he testified against his co-conspirators, revealing details even Charles's documents hadn't contained. The network extended to Virginia, the Carolinas, even into the Free Territories, where kidnappers worked with corrupt officials to recapture and enslave free black people. The trials became a sensation. Northern newspapers sent reporters. Abolitionists used the revelations as ammunition. Even some moderate Southerners expressed shock at the scale of the criminal operation. But conviction in courtrooms didn't translate to immediate freedom. The legal reality was complex. People acquired through fraud might have their sales voided, but that didn't automatically make them free. Many had been legally enslaved before being illegally sold. Sorting legitimate from fraudulent claims was a nightmare of paperwork and precedent. Judge Harrison did his best, but even he was constrained by law. "I can void illegal sales," he explained during one frustrating session. "I can punish the criminals, but I cannot declare slavery itself illegal. That's beyond my authority." "Then whose authority is it?" Elijah demanded. Harrison looked at him with sad eyes. "That, Mr. Carter, is a question for politicians, not judges, and until they answer it, we work within the system we have." The system they had was maddeningly slow. By November, 5 people from the original 23 had been granted freedom through various legal mechanisms. Proof they'd been free before being kidnapped, evidence of fraudulent enslavement, technical errors in ownership documents. 5 free out of 23. The others remained in limbo, legally bound to the Duvalier estate while their cases proceeded through the courts. Eleanor had filed manumission papers for all of them, but even that process took time, money, and legal maneuvering. "It's not enough," Eleanor said one evening, staring at the legal documents scattered across her desk. "We save 5 people while millions remain enslaved. We expose one network while hundreds more operate freely. It's not enough." "It's all we can do," Wright replied gently. "Is it?" Eleanor looked up at him. "The documents we found, they mentioned other operations, other cities." "What if we—" "No!" Wright's voice was firm. "Thee has done extraordinary work, Eleanor, but thee cannot save everyone. Thee is one woman with limited resources fighting an entire social order. If thee tries to take on more than thee can manage, thee will accomplish nothing." "He's right," Elijah said from the doorway. Neither of them had heard him enter. "We can't fight everything at once, but we can do something else." "What?" Eleanor asked. "We can teach people to fight for themselves." Elijah stepped into the room carrying a bundle of papers. "The registry I've been keeping, it's more than just names, it's connections, networks. Some of the people we've interviewed know about underground railroad routes. Others know which officials can be bribed, which ones can be trusted. One woman remembered the names of 3 ship captains who'll take passengers no questions asked." He spread the papers out. "What if we compiled all this information? Not just for courts, but for the people who need it, a guide to resistance, to escape, to survival." Wright looked alarmed. "That would be incredibly dangerous." "Everything we've done has been dangerous," Elijah countered. "This is just dangerous in a different direction." Eleanor studied the documents, her mind racing. "We'd need to be careful. Coded language, multiple copies hidden in different locations. And we'd need a distribution network, people willing to pass the information along." "We have 18 people living here who've agreed to stay and work," Elijah said. "Each of them has connections to other plantations, other communities. If each person shares the information with just 2 trusted individuals, and they share with 2 more, it grows exponentially, Eleanor finished. Like Céline's letter, one truth, carefully preserved, reaching people we'll never meet. Wright removed his spectacles, rubbing his eyes. If thee is caught doing this, no amount of legal maneuvering will save thee. Thee would face serious criminal charges. I know, Eleanor said quietly, but Mr. Wright, every day we spend in courtrooms, people are dying on plantations, children are being separated from parents, women are being... She couldn't finish the sentence. We can't wait for the legal system to catch up to basic humanity. We have to act. Acting rashly gets people killed, Wright warned. So does waiting, Elijah said simply. The room fell silent. Finally, Wright sighed. I cannot officially condone this. As an officer of the court, I must advise against it strongly. Understood, Eleanor said. However, Wright continued, the tiniest smile touching his lips, if someone were to compile such information, and if that someone were to leave said compilation in, say, a Quaker meeting house in Philadelphia, where it might be found by people associated with certain charitable organizations, well, I suppose I might not notice such a document until it was too late to stop its distribution. Elijah and Eleanor exchanged glances. Hypothetically speaking, of course, Wright added. Of course, Eleanor agreed, fighting a smile. They began that night. The project consumed them. Elijah interviewed everyone he could reach, people at the estate, visitors, travelers passing through. He gathered names of sympathetic doctors, free black communities that offered sanctuary, churches that secretly aided runaways, and even details about patroller schedules in different counties. Eleanor contributed what she knew of high society, which families were genuinely sympathetic to abolition despite their silence, which politicians might be swayed with the right pressure, which shipping companies had captains willing to look the other way. Martha and the other residents added practical knowledge. How to treat wounds without a doctor, how to navigate by stars, which plants were edible, how to move through different types of terrain. The document grew. 20 pages. 40. 60. They wrote in careful code, using terms that would mean one thing to casual observers and another to those who knew to look deeper. Traveling to market meant escape. Consulting with doctors meant finding safe houses. Sending correspondence meant passing messages through the network. It took 6 weeks to complete. The result was a slim volume, handwritten, that looked like a mundane record book, but contained information that could save hundreds of lives, routes, contacts, strategies, warnings. They made 5 copies, each painstakingly transcribed by hand. One went to Wright, who promised to get it to Philadelphia. One was hidden in the Duvalier estate's cellar, wrapped in oilskin. The other 3 were given to trusted individuals heading north, south, and west. What do we call it? Martha asked as they wrapped the final copy. Elijah thought for a moment, remembering Céline's letter, remembering the truth that had set them all on this path. The child's testament, he said quietly, in honor of someone who chose truth when it was easier to stay silent. On Christmas Eve, 1856, the first copy reached Philadelphia. Within a month, it had been reproduced and distributed to 17 different locations. By spring of 1857, versions of The Child's Testament were circulating throughout the South, passed hand to hand, memorized and destroyed to prevent discovery, whispered about in quarters and back rooms. No one knew who'd created it. Rumors attributed it to various sources: escaped slaves, northern abolitionists, even sympathetic plantation owners. Eleanor, Elijah, and Wright said nothing, letting the document speak for itself. The impact was impossible to quantify, but stories filtered back. A family reunited after 10 years apart because the testament listed a contact in Cincinnati. A woman who escaped using a route detailed in its pages. A man who avoided a notorious slave catcher because the testament warned of his tactics. One document couldn't end slavery. One act of resistance couldn't topple an entire system, but it was something, and sometimes something is enough to keep hope alive. Spring 1857 brought unexpected news to Natchez. Judge Harrison had died, peacefully in his sleep, but his death meant the cases he'd been overseeing were transferred to a new judge. Judge William Morrison was known for his strict interpretation of property law, and his first action was to review all of Harrison's pending decisions. Eleanor received the summons on a Tuesday morning. All residents of the Duvalier estate were to appear in court for a comprehensive review of their legal status. "This is bad," Wright said when he arrived that afternoon. "Morrison is a traditionalist. He'll look at the letter of the law, not the spirit, and technically, legally, most of these people are still considered property." "But Harrison voided the sales," Eleanor protested. "He ruled the acquisitions were fraudulent. He issued temporary injunctions pending investigation. He never made final rulings, and Morrison isn't bound by Harrison's preliminary findings." Wright's expression was grim. "He could reverse everything, order everyone sold at public auction to satisfy your husband's debts." The blood drained from Eleanor's face. "No, we've come too far. They've been living as free people, earning wages, making plans. You can't just—" "The law can do precisely that," Wright interrupted gently. "I'm sorry, Eleanor, but we need to prepare for the possibility that we lose, that Morrison rules against us, that everyone here is declared property and sold." The news spread through the estate like wildfire. That evening, Eleanor called a meeting in what had once been the grand ballroom, but now served as a communal gathering space. 18 people sat before her. 5 others had already been freed and moved north. 18 souls whose futures hung on the whim of a judge who'd never met them. "I won't lie to you," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her fear. "The new judge may rule against us. If he does, legally, I have no power to stop what happens next," but she paused, choosing her words carefully. "But there are other options." "What options?" Samuel asked quietly. Eleanor glanced at Wright, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. "You could leave. Tonight. Before the court date. Head north using the routes documented in the testament. I have money, not much left, but enough to give each of you a start, and I have contacts who can help once you reach free territory." The room erupted in whispers. "That's escape," Martha said flatly. "That puts a price on our heads, makes us fugitives for life." "It also makes you free," Elijah countered. He stood, addressing the group. "I'm not going to tell anyone what to do, but I'll tell you what I've decided. I'm not standing in that courtroom waiting for a white man to decide if I'm property. I'm leaving, tomorrow night, and anyone who wants to come with me is welcome." "That's insane," one of the older men said. "They'll hunt us. Dogs, patrols, bounty hunters." "They're already hunting us," Elijah interrupted. "Every day we exist in this country, we're prey. At least this way, we're prey that's running toward freedom instead of waiting for the slaughterhouse." Eleanor spoke up. "I need you all to understand something. If you run, I can't protect you. I can't claim ignorance. The authorities will know I helped. I'll face criminal charges, probably lose everything that's left." "Then don't help us," Martha said quietly. "We can leave without your involvement, let you claim we stole supplies and escaped on our own." "No," Eleanor's voice was firm. "If you go, I'm helping, openly, and I'll face whatever consequences come. It's the least I can do after years of benefiting from a system built on your suffering." Wright cleared his throat. "If I might offer a third option, more cautious, but potentially effective." All eyes turned to him. "We fight Morrison's ruling. We appeal to higher courts if necessary. Some of these still have strong legal claims, proof of prior freedom, evidence of fraud, technical errors in documentation. Others," he paused, "others have weaker cases. For those individuals, I recommend careful consideration of all options, including departure before the ruling." "So split the group," Samuel said. "Some stay and fight legally, others run." "It's a strategic division," Wright explained. Those with the strongest cases remain, establishing legal precedents that could help others in the future. Those with weaker cases preserve their freedom through other means. Both paths serve the larger goal. Elijah shook his head. That leaves people behind. Leaves them vulnerable. Every choice leaves someone vulnerable, Wright said gently. That's the nature of fighting an unjust system from within. We make impossible choices and pray we've chosen wisely. And the debate continued late into the night. By dawn, a decision had emerged, not unanimous, but accepted. 7 people would stay and fight in court, their cases being the strongest legally. 11 would leave, following routes north that the testament had documented. Eleanor would help both groups, consequences be damned. The next 3 days were a controlled chaos of preparation. Eleanor sold more furniture, converted silverware to cash, bought supplies that could plausibly be for estate maintenance, but would actually stock the runaways' journey. Elijah organized the routes, coordinating with contacts Wright had provided. The plan was complex. The group would split into 3 smaller parties, taking different paths to avoid detection. One group would head to Memphis and then north through Illinois. Another would move east toward the Appalachian passes. The third would risk the direct route through Tennessee. Martha, surprisingly, chose to stay and fight. "I'm 63 years old," she said when Eleanor questioned her decision. "I'm not running through swamps anymore. But I can stand in a courtroom. I can testify. I can make them see me as human. That's my fight now." The night before the departure, Eleanor gathered the 11 leaving. "I don't know if we'll ever see each other again," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I want you to know, whatever happens to me, whatever the courts do, it's worth it. Meeting you, learning from you, fighting alongside you, it's the only worthwhile thing I've ever done." Samuel stepped forward. "Mrs. Duvalier, when we first came here, I hated you. Everything you represented, everything you'd benefited from. I'm not going to say I don't hate that anymore." Eleanor nodded, accepting his honesty. "But," Samuel continued, "I've seen you change. I've seen you choose better. And that matters. Maybe it doesn't erase the past, but it matters for the future. So thank you for choosing." One by one, the others offered similar sentiments. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement, recognition that people could change, that redemption was possible even in the darkest circumstances. Elijah was the last to speak. He held out his hand to Eleanor, not as servant to mistress, but as equal to equal. "I used to think Celine's letter saved us," he said quietly. "But it wasn't the letter, it was what the letter represented. The idea that truth matters, that one person's courage can change everything. You honored her legacy. You became what she hoped the world could be." Eleanor took his hand, tears streaming down her face. "Be safe, be free, be everything they tried to prevent you from being." "I will," Elijah promised. "And Eleanor, when they ask you in court why you helped us escape, tell them the truth. Tell them because it was right. Tell them because slavery is wrong. Make them hear it." At midnight, under a moonless sky, 11 people slipped away from the Duvalier estate. They moved silently through the gardens where Eleanor's husband had once walked, past the quarters where they'd been imprisoned, toward a future uncertain but chosen. Eleanor watched them go, standing alone in the darkness. When the last figure disappeared into the trees, she returned to the house and began writing her testimony for the upcoming trial. If she was going down, she'd go down telling the truth. 3 days later, she stood in Morrison's courtroom. The judge was a stern man, 50-ish, with the bearing of someone who'd never questioned his own authority. He reviewed the documents Wright presented with obvious skepticism. "Mrs. Duvalier," Morrison said finally, "are you aware that 11 individuals previously residing on your estate have absconded?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Did you facilitate this escape?" The courtroom fell silent. Wright had advised her to claim ignorance, to protect herself, But Eleanor thought of Celine's letter, of Elijah's courage, of 18 months of learning what it meant to choose right over easy. Yes, Your Honor. I facilitated their departure. I provided supplies, money, and information about routes to free territory. I did so willingly and would do so again. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Morrison's face reddened. You admit to theft of property? To aiding fugitives? To violating federal law? I admit to helping human beings escape slavery, Eleanor said clearly. If that's a crime, then I'm guilty. But I'm not the criminal here, Your Honor. The crime is a system that considers people property. The crime is laws that treat mothers and children as commodities. The crime is judges who enforce such laws while claiming to represent justice. You will watch your tongue in my courtroom. Morrison slammed his gavel. Why? Eleanor challenged. What more can you do to me? Take my house? Take my money? I've already lost everything that matters. But those 11 people, they're free now. They're beyond your reach, and that's worth any price you impose. Morrison looked apoplectic. I could have you arrested right now, imprisoned. Then do it, Eleanor said calmly. Prove to everyone watching that telling the truth about slavery is more dangerous than slavery itself. Prove that this system fears honesty more than violence. Go ahead, Your Honor. Make me a martyr. See how well that serves your cause. The judge's hand trembled on his gavel. He looked around the courtroom, at the reporters scribbling notes, at the observers watching intently, at Wright's carefully neutral expression. Finally, Morrison spoke through gritted teeth. I find Mrs. Eleanor Duvalier in contempt of court. She will be fined and placed under house arrest pending further proceedings. He turned to the remaining 7 residents of the Duvalier estate. As for these individuals, I require additional time to review their cases. They will remain under court supervision for another 60 days. It wasn't freedom, but it wasn't immediate re-enslavement either. It was, Martha reflected later, the same limbo they'd been living in for months. But something had shifted. Eleanor's testimony was reported in newspapers throughout the South and North. Some papers condemned her as a traitor to her race and class. Others praised her courage. Abolitionists reprinted her words as evidence that even Southerners could see the evil of slavery. The publicity put pressure on Morrison. He couldn't simply rule against the remaining 7 without appearing to validate Eleanor's criticism. He needed to appear just, measured, thoughtful. So he delayed, and delayed again. And in those delays, Wright filed appeal after appeal, motion after motion, slowly building a legal fortress around Martha and the 6 others. By summer, 3 more had been freed through various legal mechanisms. By autumn, 2 more. Martha and 1 other, a young woman named Grace, remained in legal limbo. But then, unexpectedly, Grace's case broke through. A distant relative in Pennsylvania produced documentation proving Grace had been born free but kidnapped at age 12. Morrison, unable to refute the evidence, reluctantly granted her freedom. That left only Martha. Her case was the most complicated. Enslaved from birth, sold multiple times legitimately before being acquired through Pemberton's fraudulent network. Wright argued that the fraud tainted the entire chain of ownership, but Morrison was unconvinced. The final hearing was set for December 1857, more than a year after that first night in Eleanor's room. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread that this would be the conclusive ruling on the last of the Duvalier cases, and people came from across the state to witness it. Martha sat beside Wright, her back straight, her expression calm. She'd prepared for this moment for months, knowing it could go either way. Morrison reviewed the final arguments, his face unreadable. Finally he spoke. This has been among the most complex cases I've overseen. The intersection of legitimate sale and fraudulent network, the question of where one ends and the other begins. He paused. Legally, I find the arguments for continued bondage compelling. However, Martha's heart sank at that however. However, Morrison continued, I am also compelled by another consideration. Mrs. Duvalier's testimony, while contemptuous in its delivery, raised a point that has troubled me. If we cannot distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate claims of ownership, if the system is so corrupted that fraud and law are indistinguishable, then perhaps the system itself requires examination. He looked directly at Martha. I cannot declare slavery illegal. That is beyond my authority. But I can recognize that in your specific case, the chain of ownership is so tainted by fraud that no legitimate claim exists. Therefore, I rule that Martha Williams is free, not through manumission, but through the determination that no valid ownership was ever established. The courtroom erupted. Martha sat frozen, unable to process what she'd heard. You're free, Wright whispered, tears in his eyes. Martha, you're free. Eleanor, sitting in the gallery under continued house arrest, smiled through her own tears. Morrison's ruling was narrow. It freed Martha but didn't challenge slavery broadly. Yet it established a precedent. Fraud in acquisition could void ownership entirely, not just the immediate sale. It was a tiny crack in the wall. But cracks, as Céline's letter had proven, could grow. Epilogue. 7 years later, April 1865, Natchez, Mississippi. Eleanor Duvalier stood in the ruins of her estate. The war had not been kind to Mississippi. The house had been burned by Union soldiers in 1863, the gardens overtaken by weeds, the quarters torn down for firewood during the occupation. But Eleanor had survived. She'd spent the war years in the North, testifying at abolitionist meetings, writing about her experiences, earning enough through speaking fees to live modestly. Now, with Lee's surrender barely a week old, she'd returned to see what remained. Not much, as it turned out, just memories and ashes. Mrs. Duvalier? She turned to find an unfamiliar woman approaching, black, perhaps 30, with a little girl holding her hand. Yes? The woman smiled. You don't know me. My name is Ruth. I'm Samuel's wife. We met in Ohio in 1858. He used to tell me stories about you, about the night everyone escaped, about the testament. Eleanor's eyes widened. Samuel, is he? He's alive, living in Pennsylvania. We have 3 children now. He's a carpenter, doing well. Ruth's smile faded slightly. He asked me to come here if I ever could. To tell you something. What? That he made it. That we made it. That the choice you helped him make, to run toward freedom instead of waiting for permission, it saved his life. Our lives. Our children's lives. Ruth squeezed her daughter's hand. He wanted you to know it mattered. That you mattered. Eleanor felt tears welling up. And the others, Elijah, Grace. Elijah made it to Canada. Last we heard, he was working with the refugees coming across the border, helping them settle. Grace married a preacher in Ohio. Martha. Ruth's voice caught. Martha died last year, natural causes in her sleep, but free, she died free. They stood together in the ruins, 2 women connected by a night 7 years ago when impossible choices had been made. What will you do now? Ruth asked. Eleanor looked at the burned foundation of her house, then at the land stretching beyond it. I don't know. The estate is worthless. My name is still controversial. I have no family, no fortune, no real home. But you have a story, Ruth said quietly. And stories matter. They change things. Samuel says that's what the Testament taught him, that one true story told bravely can start a revolution. Eleanor laughed softly. I'm hardly revolutionary. Neither was Céline Bellamont, Ruth countered. She was just a little girl who wrote the truth, but her truth freed dozens of people, maybe hundreds who used the Testament. Your truth, standing in that courtroom, defying the judge, it inspired people, made them think differently. That's revolutionary enough. The little girl tugged on her mother's hand, eager to go. Ruth smiled apologetically. We need to catch our train, but before we go, she pulled something from her bag, a book, bound in simple cloth. This is being published next month. The full history of the trafficking network, compiled from court records and testimonies, including yours." She handed it to Eleanor. "They asked me to give you the first copy. They thought you should see it before anyone else." Eleanor took the book with trembling hands. The title was embossed in simple letters: "The Child's Testament, Truth and Freedom in the American South." "We're telling the story," Ruth said. "All of it. The darkness and the light, the evil and the resistance, the people who chose wrong and the people who chose right. Because that's how we make sure it never happens again, by remembering, by speaking the truth." She hugged Eleanor quickly, then took her daughter's hand and walked toward town. Eleanor stood alone in the ruins, holding the book, watching them go. And she thought about Céline, writing her letter by candlelight, about Elijah, choosing to run toward freedom, about Martha, standing in a courtroom, demanding to be seen as human, about Samuel and Ruth and Grace and all the others, building lives from the ashes of bondage, about herself, learning that redemption wasn't granted. It was earned every day through choosing truth over comfort, right over easy, love over fear. The war was over. Slavery was ended, at least legally, but the work of building a just world was just beginning. Eleanor opened the book and began to read, learning her own story alongside the stories of dozens of others, all their voices woven together into a testament of survival, resistance, and hope. Behind her, the Mississippi River flowed on, carrying away the past and bringing in the future, indifferent to human suffering and human triumph alike. But humans weren't indifferent. Humans remembered, humans told stories, humans chose. And sometimes that was enough, sometimes that was everything. The sun set over Natchez, painting the sky in colors that looked like fire and hope, and the breaking dawn all at once. And Eleanor Duvalier, once a wealthy widow imprisoned by her own complicity, now simply Eleanor, witness, testifier, believer in truth, smiled. The house was gone. The fortune was gone. The curse was broken, but the story remained, and the story was enough.